Welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, the podcast that helps aircraft owners and aviation businesses learn and understand the complex world of aviation insurance and risk management. From the basic principles of aviation insurance to risk management techniques and updates on the aviation insurance market, the Aviation Insurance Podcast is your guide to traverse the world of aviation insurance. Now, here's your host, Tim Bonnell.
Well, welcome to the Aviation Insurance Podcast, a podcast where we talk about some of the fundamentals of insurance and risk management that apply to the aviation insurance industry. And we spend a lot of time talking about aircraft insurance policies and airport or aviation commercial general liability policies and a lot of the things that go with that. And today I want to talk about something that is an exposure for many aviation operations, and that is property and contents insurance. And, a lot of aircraft owners and operators either own a hangar or they lease a hangar where they have a contractual obligation to insure the building. Others don't own the building, but they have contents. They have things that they use in their operations like tugs and golf carts and many things like this. But there's a lot of property value and content value that often needs to be insured. And so the commercial property form is the place where that is typically covered, whether it's a private hangar, a corporate hangar, the airport owning all the hangars, whether that's, just the mobile equipment and, desks and computers and furniture and all those things. This is the place to cover that exposure. And so under commercial property policy, a lot of things can be done. First, you can cover real property. Real property is defined in the policy, but it's to the effect of it's the building and the property used to support the building. So the building, things permanently attached to it. Oftentimes the HVAC will fall into that. Typically there's a few other things that may not typically be considered real property that fall under the definition of real property, but it's important to know that definition because you want to make sure your values, your insured amounts are correct. So we can cover the real property, then we can cover our business and personal property. So that's the property, as we talked about, that is owned by the insured, that is not covered under the building coverage. That's the desks, the furnitures, the other things. Anything that's generally going to be at that facility most of the time can fall under business personal property. A third primary area is personal property of others. Now, if we're working on aircraft or taking aircraft into our care, custody, or control, we cover those aircraft under the commercial general liability policy under the hangar keeper's legal liability limit. But you may have other things. It could be baggage. It could be other people's, if you're taking in engines or other instruments to repair, you could have personal property of other that's not an aircraft in your care, custody, control, and this is a great place to cover that. Then there are a lot of different coverage extensions, and that's something that I want to talk about here pretty soon. But there's a couple other key things just at a high level in the commercial property policy that's helpful to understand. Typically, there are three primary bases or ways that a commercial property policy is written on as it pertains to the type of losses it covers. So we call that the cause of loss forms. The first is basic, which has a list of a handful of perils or exposures that policy will cover. Typically, fire, wind, lightning, hail, those type of things. So a basic cause of loss form will only give you a limited few exposures that it covers. The next one is called the broad policy, which gives those initial, and then it gives a longer list of exposures that it covers. The third type, and the one typically most people want in general terms, is the special cause form of loss. Basically is any direct risk that falls within the scope of the policy that's not excluded, right? These are all occurrence-based, as we've talked about in aircraft and aviation CGLs, meaning that an occurrence has to happen, right? There has to be direct damage to the property. And again, that falls under the scope of the policy, and it will respond to that direct loss within the premises described there for the building, which is usually an address or within 1,000 feet again, read the policy to make sure that you have that information correct. One of the ways we also talk about valuation, and in aircraft insurance, we write on what's called an agreed amount or stated value policy, meaning that the amount that the insurance company and the insured agrees on that's stated in the declaration is the amount that will be paid in the event of a loss. That's typically how an aircraft policy is written. A lot of automobile policies are written to where it's actual cash value, meaning it's going to take, the original cost minus depreciation, effectively what the car is worth that day. Well, in many and most property policies, they're written on a replacement cost basis, saying they're going to insure this for what it's going to cost to replace it. But there can be some issues with that. Typically, some property carriers will put in a coinsurance clause. And what that means is if the building is insured for this replacement cost coverage, we're going to say that you need to be carrying at least 80% of the value, for instance. It could be 80%, could be 90%, could be 100%. But if it says we have an 80% coinsurance clause, when they're at the time of a loss, whenever that happens during the policy period, the amount of coverage you were carrying needs to be at least 80% of what the total value of that building was at the time of a loss. Now, this is important because a partial loss that is certainly less than the coverage, they're still going to apply this same principle. They're going to say, hey, what's the cost to fully repair this today? And if you weren't carrying 80% of the total limit of what that would cost, we are going to only pay this percentage. And there's a calculation we're not going to get into, but it can add up quite a bit if the building's undervalued. So the bottom line is not to remember all these little facts, but coinsurance can be a bad thing, especially when the cost of lumber and supplies are skyrocketing. The cost to replace or repair a building can go up considerably. So what we'd like to do is a couple things. Number one, some carriers don't have a coinsurance clause with a replacement cost. Number two, you can also go on an agreed amount or agreed value basis on your property, like you can on your aircraft policy. And those are ways to avoid that coinsurance trap. Coinsurance can allow a little bit less expensive, a little bit less premium at times, but it's not worth it because it just leaves too much up to chance where there could be a large, basically coinsurance penalty for not carrying the proper value. So that's something we'd just like to point out when you're insuring your hangar, your buildings, your operation. Watch out for coinsurance. Use agreed amount or find a carrier that does not have a coinsurance penalty. But that's the one thing to pay attention to on a high level. So there are a number of other additional property-related coverages that we just like to touch on. And given the number of those, we'll do that in the next episode. So that's all for this time. Join us again in the next episode as we continue navigating the waypoints in aviation insurance. Until then, enjoy clear skies and unlimited visibility.
Thanks for listening to the Aviation Insurance Podcast. If you found this episode of value, please share it with someone who would benefit from this information. Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast player so you don't miss any new episodes and to help our show have more impact. This episode is brought to you by Aeris Insurance Solutions, your flight plan for navigating the turbulence of aviation insurance. For more information, visit aerisinsurance.com. That is www.aerisinsurance.com. Disclaimer. These episodes are for educational purposes only, and due to the changing regulatory and legal nature of the business, some information may change over time. Having a well-educated and experienced aviation insurance broker on your team is an absolute requirement to success in business and for managing your aircraft and aviation business risks.